If at any point in the last year you happen to have had internet access, you've likely seen, heard of, or encountered the online marketplace known as Temu, which works with suppliers overseas, predominantly in China, to provide you the lowest cost for goods across a variety of different industries. This is a company I've heard of a lot over the past year, and they actually reached out to me asking if I would be willing to review some of their products. You may happen to know, if you're a longtime viewer, that I've actually worked with some Chinese suppliers and distributors for different videos on the channel, so I was interested to see what sort of things Temu would be willing to send me. And so they gave me an option to browse through different products on their site. I saw largely the sorts of things that I've seen on AliExpress and other such Chinese supplier sites, and they sent me a big array of products that we are going to be looking at today. These products span across a variety of different applications for different brass instruments, and you can find links to all of them down in the video description. And what's more that you can find in the description or the pinned comment is Temu's offer to you, my viewers, for checking out this video. They are willing to give you a $100 coupon bundle if you follow the link to download their app, or if you already have their app, you can use the promo code DUW9758 to get that bundle. And as we get into the actual review portion of this video, I just want to mention all of these are going to be reviewed from as objective and as utilitarian of a perspective as possible. I've tested these products out to the best of my ability. I know there are different viewers on my channel with different levels of interest or trust in these types of products, but we're going to be looking at everything just objectively from what it costs versus what it provides. So let's get started. Sometimes it's nice to be able to set your trumpet down in rehearsal or at home in a way that doesn't involve balancing it precariously on its bell or setting it on a chair or a table or somewhere where it might get knocked over. And a lot of us are probably familiar with the stands made by companies like Myers in Germany or Hercules. These are all great options, but Temu happens to offer one of their own that is very much a copy of the Myers. It functions very much the same way. You get a cone section with legs that fold into it. You take those legs out, you unfold them, splay them out, you screw the cone back on, and that holds your trumpet in place. It's a pretty decent copy with just a couple of small differences. First things first, the legs on a K&M stand are going to be very loose and very ready to just flay out as soon as you take them out of the cone. The legs on this Chinese equivalent are a little bit more reluctant to move, and as a result, you kind of have to force them into place a little bit more, and the stand doesn't balance automatically, just gravitationally, the way a sincere K&M would. And so you have to make sure that all the legs are indeed fully extended and fully splayed before you put the cone on, or after, I guess, but then you need to screw the cone down a little bit further. And the other thing is the flare of the cone section is a tiny bit smaller to my understanding than a K&M, but it seems to fit both standard and slightly oversized trumpet bells pretty well. In fact, that Con Director cornet behind me, which has an oversized 5 1/8 inch bell and a pretty large bell throat to accompany it, is actually sitting on that very same trumpet stand that I got from Temu. Initially, I figured it was a fine enough stand for home display, but didn't really trust it in an actual live group setting where it could easily get knocked over and not provide the same amount of support as a K&M, but I did end up testing it out at a basketball game at my school. I play in the pep band, and the pep band does a lot of cheers in addition to playing, so we tend to have to set our instruments down for, honestly, more time than we spend playing. And so I took it to a pep band game with my Constellation trumpet, which also has a slightly oversized bell, like the Director. And honestly, even with the entire pep band and student section, at this point a couple hundred people, jumping up and down in the stands, and the stands are wobbling disconcertingly, and our trumpets are swaying a little bit side to side, the Constellation stayed standing just as well as any of the others. So honestly, the Temu stand is worth some consideration. If you're at all the observant type, you may have noticed there are a lot of brass instruments under this roof, and a lot of them are vintage instruments that don't tend to come with cases of their own because the original cases that they would have been supplied with have long since disintegrated into dust. And so that leaves yours truly with all these instruments under his roof wondering, how am I going to store all of these? And not for nothing, but if you've Googled the price of cases for any instrument recently, yeah, it's not looking good. They're really, really pricey. A lot of the time, I would have to pay more than I paid for some of these instruments just to store them, one or two of them in a case. It's kind of ridiculous. So anyway, those were some of my motivating factors when I went to Temu and browsed through their listings to see if they had any cases worth reviewing. Now, in general, I've had mixed impressions of Chinese-made cases. A lot of them look nice out of the box, but either zippers break or something else doesn't hold up over the years. I've had some that have held up fine and some that have held up terribly. I went with this gig bag that I found on the website that looked interesting, and honestly, so far, my impressions have been fine. Again, it's a good-looking case. I like the red color. There are, I'm sure, other colors to choose from. couple nice features I noticed were the dual zipper. That's a really nice feature to have, and it's commonly overlooked. I've owned much nicer cases from more reputable makers that honestly don't have a dual zipper, and it's really annoying because the zipper can only be oriented one way. There are also backpack straps, which are always a nice touch. As far as actually storing the instrument, I had some qualms. My Yamaha 732 with a 5-inch bell hardly fit in there. I had to kind of weasel it in. I imagine a 5 1/8 inch bell would be even more of a challenge. And honestly, it does fit snugly once you fit it in, but obviously a gig bag like this doesn't offer the most protection, so I like it just for storing instruments at home. I don't know that I'd be willing to chuck it in my trunk or on a plane to take to a gig or anything. I'd be a little wary about that. But again, with the price of cases these days, honestly, you can't go wrong with something like this if you just have too many instruments at home. Again, the observant eyes among you in my audience may have noticed that I am a nut for mouthpieces. I wish I could say that that 54 count rack was all of them, but no, there are dozens more throughout my apartment, and they just keep piling up. I'm trying to sell them off, and yet I keep acquiring new ones. It's a thing of mine. Anyhow, this is a product I've actually been aware of for many years, so when I saw it on Temu, I was really interested to give it a try. This is a trumpet mouthpiece kit in which you're given an underpart, 4 different cups, and 2 different rims. I believe it's based on the Stanvi modular configuration, and what's offered in this set is a 2 and a 3 rim, and a 2B, 2C, 3B, and 3C cup configuration. The tolerances are decent, not on the level of something like Reeves or Giardinelli or box screw rims or anything like that, but the threads go together nicely. I didn't notice any airiness in the sound that would be caused by a lack of air tightness due to poor tolerancing. Now, one of my gripes with Chinese mouthpieces in the past is that they've been very inconsistent in terms of size. If you got just an unbranded Chinese 3C, there's no telling whether it would actually be equivalent in size to a Bach 3C, or if the cutters took out a little bit too much metal and it's actually a 1C, or if it's something crazy small like a 9 or a 10.5C. There really is no telling, unfortunately, so I made sure to judiciously measure all of these parts, and indeed the 2 inner diameter is actually a little bit roomier than the 3. Additionally, both the B cups are deeper than their C counterparts, which is good, and if you try to mismatch parts, like let's say you put a 2 rim with a 3C cup, you would see a ledge going in. These are actually fairly well machined parts, and I think they are the correct sort of nominal size that you would expect to find from Bach mouthpieces. I did make sure to test out and do a little bit of recording on all 4 configurations, and honest to goodness, all 4 sound quite good. I don't know where else you're going to get 4 different sizes to test out for this kind of a price, and they are all distinct, but they all do produce a nice, full, rounded sort of tone. The 3C is by far the brightest, but it's not too harsh. The 2C kind of has a bigger sound to it. The B cups are each a little bit softer and fluffier than their C cup equivalents. None of them are screamer pieces or necessarily anything phenomenal in the upper register, but honestly, for the type of price that you get this whole set for, I don't think you're going to find anything much better, and that honestly is a little bit surprising to me. I hadn't expected them to sound as good or fit together as well as they honestly do. I think the main merit of something like this is for a trumpet teacher to keep this in their studio to allow students to try out different configurations. You have sort of a medium inner diameter, a relatively roomy one, a fairly mid-sized cup depth, and a slightly deeper cup depth. Obviously, it's not going to cover all the options, but I think it's worth having around just for that purpose. There's a video on YouTube that I've watched several times at this point over the years, showcasing the collection of the great Sergei Nakaryakov, one of the world's best living trumpet players at this time, and at one point he does this funny bit where he holds up an aluminum straight mute, and he goes, "You think this is Dennis Wick? This mute was made in Minsk and it cost me 15 rubles. Now, I don't know how familiar you are with the Russian ruble, but I can assure you that at no point in history has 15 of them equated to some sort of massive fortune in terms of US dollars, and I think that showcases a great point. When it comes to things like your straight mute on trumpet, you really don't need to splurge like crazy. If it's made from aluminum or some aluminum adjacent metal, and it looks generally like that, it probably does fine. And in fact, this very straight mute is one of the things that the Temu team sent me as part of this bundle. It looks fairly small on first glance, and if you do mass it out, it turns out to be about 2/3 that of a typical full-size aluminum straight, like my Liberty straight mute by ProTech. but it does still fit full-size bells. You'll see it'll fit anything 4 7/8 or 5 inches. It fits the con director bell, which is good. It can fit smaller bells that were made on specific smaller E-flat mandrels, but surprisingly it isn't actually meant for them. It doesn't fit them necessarily any better than the Liberty does. Now, to ensure that I reviewed this mute fairly, I took it to the practice room along with my Liberty and demoed the two side by side with some multi-track recording, and this was both fun and informative. First things first, when I started playing with the mute from Temu, from behind the bell I wasn't so sure I liked the sound. I didn't think it had enough muted quality to it, but it was still kind of a harsh, thin sort of sound. Listening back on the recording, I liked it a lot better, and I think it actually stacked up pretty decently to the Liberty. Again, it just goes to show that you don't really need to splurge like crazy for a straight mute. It is, again, less muted. There's less of that really zingy, metallic straight mute essence that I like to hear, and instead it's a smaller, tighter sound with a little bit more kind of conic spread to it, which was interesting. I think that's just because the mute is smaller and not quite blocking as much of the bell, and there's not as much aluminum to resonate. But nonetheless, there are some positives from that, like the low register on it was a lot better than I expected, both pitch-wise and slotting-wise. And while it is kind of a smaller and tighter sound and it doesn't have as much zing as my Liberty, it is workable by all means, and what's more is, whether a mute works or not is sort of a product of whether it blends in a section. And so if we're talking about a middle or high school band program here, just get 10 of these for under $50 and you have the whole section playing on the same mute, and it'll sound unified and it'll sound great, honestly. For me, one of the main merits of something like this is the fact that I can never remember or trust myself to actually bring my mute bag to all my different rehearsals, whether it's cornet or C trumpet or B flat trumpet or whatever else. I need those mutes with me and I tend to forget them, but I don't like to keep musical gear in my car if I can avoid it. I get really paranoid about it. So it's nice to just be able to keep this $2, $3 straight mute in the car and really not care about it. If you've ever played in a pep band or a marching band of any sort, you'll be familiar with the struggles of not having a music stand and either having to memorize your music or having a little booklet that you have to carry with you while you play. And depending on your instrument, that can range from a mild inconvenience to just about impossible. And while for trumpet players it is more of a mild inconvenience than anything, you may still elect to use something that can mount your music to your trumpet so that you still have your left hand free to hold the instrument up and play with a little bit less tension in your sound. That is the merit of something like this clip-on lyre that the Temu team sent me. Whereas a lot of lyres are just the lyre head on a stick, maybe bent a certain way, and you have to find a way to screw it onto your instrument. You have to hope that your instrument has a lyre holder and has the screw for that lyre holder and has the correct shape and configuration of lyre holder to hold that particular lyre, or you have to shop for the particular lyre that fits that holder. This is a lot more ubiquitous. All you have to do is unscrew, mount it to your instrument, and then screw it in place. What's really nice is that the clamps have these rubbery heads to them so that you can put it on snugly without damaging the finish. My one complaint here was with the screw thread, which was pretty coarse. I tried to put some oil on it to hopefully reduce the friction and make it move a little bit easier, but that caused it to actually stutter a little bit between threads. Just watch out for that. Probably don't put oil on these threads, that was my mistake, but otherwise it functions great as long as you have it tightened firmly, which won't damage your finish thanks to those soft rubbery heads. You can make sure that your music is stable and a lot easier to read than if you're holding it kind of like below your bell like this, or trying to balance both the bell and the clip in one hand. It's really not fun. So a lyre like this is very helpful. And now for all you patiently waiting French horn players in my audience, we have a product just for you. If you worked on advanced orchestra or even wind band music, you may have noticed a technique called stopping, wherein you take your usual hand position inside the bell of your horn and you stop it, you clamp it shut, and that produces a very different sound. It's sort of a muted sound, but it's very different from what you get with a horn straight mute. And stopping is a technique that takes some time to master. It certainly took some time for me, and it can be very troublesome if you have small hands trying to get the bell clamped well enough that it actually provides the right sound and there's no air leakage going on. This is another one that I took to the practice room and did some recording and comparison work with, but I didn't have any other stop mutes on hand to compare with, so I just compared it to my own hand stopping abilities. Performance was pretty similar across the board. Like any other standard stop mute or hand stopping, the general guideline is you have to change the fingering by letting go of the trigger if you had it pressed down, finding the equivalent F-side fingering, and going down a half step from there. As far as my actual impressions of this mute versus hand stopping, the pitch was similar, but the slotting and partial control felt a little bit harder on the mute than with hand stopping. But honestly, that's probably familiarity bias because I've only ever used stop mute once or twice. I really took a lot of time to figure out the actual technique for myself with my hand, and so I'm very much used to how the slotting is with hand stopping specifically and not using a stop mute, so that was maybe not the most fair test in that point. As far as the sound, there were also some differences. The mute, in comparison to hand stopping, sounded really reedy and tight to me. It was a little bit of a softer sound, a little bit less growl if I played really loudly on it, which admittedly was nice. Sometimes the sound gets really unrestrained when I try and hand stop and there's a bunch of air butting up against my hand. It is a little bit of a different experience with the mute and a little bit more pleasant. So I would say it could be good for softer passages, but overall I don't know that I was entirely sold on the tone. I think I still prefer to hand stop. But where I do think there is great merit to this is as a teaching tool. Like I said, stopping can be really hard for small or inexperienced right hands, and so if you want to be able to practice the stopped tone and stopped fingerings without having to worry about exactly what your right hand is doing, or if your hand tenses up easily, or if you got like carpal tunnel or anything like that, it's nice to have a cheap stop mute around, whether for you or your students, just to mess with and figure out the techniques before you start worrying about what goes on here. Now, tension in the hand region and carpal tunnel actually make for a great segue into our next product, surprisingly enough. If you've ever played, let's say, a student straight gooseneck tenor trombone, and then played a symphonic F attachment tenor, or especially a bass trombone side by side, you'll notice just how much heavier the attachments and rotors and extra slides make those trombones. And while a student trombone in the hands of an experienced player is generally not too much of a strain on the wrist or the fingers or the arm or anything like that, these heavier trombones can be. I play a Con 88H, and sometimes for sound reasons, I like to stick a cheeky little Con counterweight on the back, and that's fun. It gives me a nice, deep, dark, more resilient sort of tone, but it does add weight to an already slightly heavier instrument, and while I'm not personally inclined to need something like this, I think a lot of people are, and moreover, I'm interested in preventative maintenance for my body. I don't want to get to the point where I overdo it and have permanent injuries to my arm, and so I'd rather invest in a grip now to see if I can relieve some of that tension, even if it doesn't actively pain me, rather than paying the price down the road. And so one of the items that I asked for and received from Temu in this bundle was indeed this trombone hand grip. It was one of the more expensive items in the bundle, and it ate into my budget significantly, but I really was curious to see how it would stack up in alleviating some left arm tension in my playing. Again, like I said, I'm not actively in pain when I play tenor trombone, but I was interested to see how it would change the experience. First things first, it's a little bit hard to shape. It's very rigid, and so you really have to put a bit of work into it. But if you follow the general directions from them or any other manufacturer of these, like Calder Pips, they've got a good video on YouTube on how to shape these things, you can get it to a point where it wraps nicely around the cork barrel or just next to that, beneath the screw barrel on your trombone, and you can get it to basically just wrap around the top of your left hand, such that the weight pretty much just floats against this point here, which is a lot better than any tension being in your thumb, which typically needs to be free for trigger movement, or these fingers, which don't necessarily need to move while you play, but really any bodily tension besides really energizing the core of your air in brass playing is generally not a good thing. Fatigue leading to tension generally makes your sound shrink and robs you of resonance, so it's good to have something like this to relieve that tension. To be completely transparent with you, one of the items that I was most excited to receive in this whole bundle was this pack of silicone trombone slide stoppers. It sounds stupid to say aloud, but honestly, it's the little things that excite me sometimes, and moreover, all three of my trombones, my Con 88H, my King 3B, and my new King Tempo, all needed replacements of this particular part. I like to be able to set my trombone down while I'm not using it without worry of bashing the slide crook in, so something like this was long overdue. Now, of course, I can't speak for every brand of trombone since all I had in the house is Con and King, but they have very different metal receivers for these nubs. The Con one is very small and skinny and stubby, whereas the King is this big fat thing sticking out of the slide crook that doesn't look like it would fit a nub of this size, but the nubs that I received did fit both slides really well. I just had to kind of finagle it onto the wider King nubs, and I've used all three trombones since then. I've set them on the floor, I've picked them up, I've set them down again, and all of those nubs are still firmly attached. You might consider gluing them in place if they need to be, but I haven't had to do so. And honestly, my experience with them has been really positive as I expected, and I think that little parts like this are one of the best things to order from a source like Temu, because honestly, for a really meager price, sometimes like $3-4 if you're looking for a certain cheap silicone or cork part, you will get a lifetime supply. Of course, that may be different if you're a crazy collector like I am with trumpets and cornets, and let's say you have 15-20 different trombones. Yeah, you might run out eventually, but this isn't a part that you have to replace super often. If you only own a couple of trombones, this is, to all intents and purposes, a lifetime supply, and I think it's well worth it. If you care about any of the following, including your personal health and safety, the smell of your equipment, and honestly your playing experience to some extent as well, you really need to be cleaning out your instruments and your mouthpieces regularly. If you play on a set of equipment every day, you should be washing out that mouthpiece at least once a week and swabbing out your lead pipe and valve casing probably at least once a month to prevent residue buildup. And this is really important to not skip out on, because the longer you put it off, the worse the issues get. And you can end up rotting out your tubes, or you can end up getting yourself sick just from the fumes and bacteria that you've put into your instrument over time and allowed to rot and fester and grow inside there. Now, me personally, many a time in life, I've either lost my mouthpiece brush, or I've put it away nicely in a drawer somewhere where it's out of sight, out of mind, and then I don't really think about it and I'm too lazy to get it out when I do. And I end up really neglecting the maintenance on my instruments for embarrassingly long. The fact that I have so many instruments also doesn't particularly help, but I really need to be doing a better job of these things. And so, preemptively, while I do have a mouthpiece brush and a snake, before I lose it again, I decided to get this set from Temu that just has a mouthpiece brush, a valve casing brush, and a snake brush in it. I think it was marketed as a trumpet set, but especially on the mouthpiece and lead pipe swabs, the bristles are so thick that you could probably use them on most low brass instruments and mouthpieces comfortably, and you can use them on trumpet stuff, of course. You just have a little bit of extra bristle room if you need, and this is really good to have around. If you only have a few instruments and a few cases, keep one in every single case you own. Like I said, I'm terrible with out of sight, out of mind, so it really helps me to be able to see my brushes when I open my case and go, oh yeah, I haven't cleaned my mouthpiece in a little too long. Let's get that done while we're at it. And like I said with the trombone slide stoppers, these cheap little kits are some of the best things to get off Temu, because it's not something that you play on necessarily. It doesn't have to hold up to a certain sonic standard. It's not an instrument that needs to function a certain way or a case that needs to have a certain amount of protection. It's just a little thing that you keep in your case and you have as a replacement just in case you need it. Longtime viewers of the channel might remember a period of time 2-3 years ago where I was working pretty regularly as a brass instrument tech at a music shop, and that was really fun for me. I've always been fascinated with brass repair ever since about 8th grade, which was a long time ago now, the better part of a decade. But the thing is, no matter how much time I spent at the shop, I obviously never had those tools at home, and so I would acquire these vintage instruments with all manners of dings and dents in them, and moreover, I'm stupid sometimes. Occasionally I'll accidentally put a dent in one of my own nicer instruments, which sucks, but I never had the means to take those out at home. And so out of curiosity, I got this removable ball dent tool from Temu to see how it would work. It comes with a couple of fairly small dent balls, and it's marketed for trombone slides, but it's really not that specific or that universal. Dent repair is an extremely tool-dependent job, and this particular tool gives you one particular angle, one particular size of dent that you can work with, so it's not necessarily strictly for trombones, but it also won't take out all dents on a trombone, nor any other instrument. I did do some practice with it on a couple of little dents on my Con 88H, and honestly it's a fun thing to work with, but you do have to be really, really careful. I'm very rusty with my dent repair, as I quickly learned, and so I'm probably going to have to get a bigger set of these so that I have a more proper tool to more easily do the job. The bottom line here is the wrong size ball does a poor job in any repairman's hands. So definitely, if you're going to look into something like this, make sure you've got a full enough set and enough expertise to be doing stuff like this don't be dumb like me. I would definitely make this one recommendation. When you use this tool, take your most throwaway slide or cork grease and coat the dent ball in that to reduce the friction between that and whatever tube you happen to be repairing at the time. That definitely makes things move a little bit more smoothly. It creates less scratching internally. It's just a better way of doing things, and it's one of many little things I learned as a repairman over the years. And that is a wrap. Thank you to the team over at Temu for supplying me with these goods for this video. I really enjoyed putting all of them through their paces, and I hope you enjoyed watching as I did so. Until next time, you can find more product reviews in the playlist in the top right corner of the card. I appreciate you sticking around. We'll see you on the flip side.